Welcome to this open lecture arranged by the Network for Psychedelic Science and Stockholm University. My name is Sebastian Oslind and I'm an active member of NPV and a master level student here at SU. Today I have the honor of introducing this lecture on psychedelic science held by Christopher Timmermann. This lecture is a part of a series of lectures arranged by NPV. So if you would like to stay updated about more events like this, you can find NPV on social media or become a member and subscribe on our mailing list. This lecture will be recorded. It will take about an hour, right? And it will be followed by a Q&A session. So Christopher Timmermann is a PhD and obtained a Bachelor of Science in Psychology in Santiago, Chile, and a Master's in Cognitive Science at the University of Bologna in Italy. He's based at Imperial College in London at the Center of Psychedelic Research, where he led the first neuroimaging research on the effects of the potent psychedelic DMT in the human brain and consciousness, as well as its potential clinical applications. His work focuses on the neuroscience, psychology, beliefs, and ethics of the psychedelic experience. He's also a member of the international interdisciplinary group ALIAS and the president of the Foundation of the Study of Human Consciousness in Chile. So without further ado, Dr. Chris Timmermann.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Sebastian, and thank you for organizing also with Gustav and everybody at MPV. And I think I gave a lecture for them online for NPV, I think members. There you go. I think some time ago, like a year ago, maybe during the, I don't remember, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And right now, I think I'm gonna do a lecture on some new ideas based on the old research that I've done and the contemporary research that I'm doing. And it has, you know, ideas that are speculative. Some of them are more kind of based on hardcore data, and I hope it's you know, exciting and interesting to all of you here. So as Daniel mentioned, I work at Imperial College London, and there we do neuroimaging research on psychedelics. More specifically, in the context, at least the work that I do, is very much linked to the context of consciousness research. So trying to understand how can we, you know, tease apart neural or neurobiological mechanisms, or if you want, counterparts to what we call conscious experience, and how psychedelics are an interesting way to perturb consciousness so that we can understand the kind of neural processes that are associated with conscious experience. And in this talk, I'm gonna precisely kind of try to address that and the peculiar way in which psychedelics sit in a very interesting interface between consciousness or richness of conscious experience, or very intuitive subjective experiences that are hard to really verbalize, systemize, categorize, and put into some form of, you know, psychometric data or psychometric testing so that we can test these things against neurobiological data, right? So that's the, you know, what I'll try to get to somehow, and where do we sit, in my opinion, with the current data on that. But I don't know how technical is the audience. Is everybody kind of like interested in neuroscience and psychology, or is it a more broad audience? Like, who knows something about neuroscience here? Awesome, nice, cool. So I'll just go also hardcore with the neuroscience then. So to start off, again, with this idea in mind of how can psychedelics can sit between, you know, what we consider neuroscience, neurobiological data, and rich phenomenal experience, some thoughts about how psychedelics sit in the continuity between mind and life. You know, we can think of mind as consciousness, life as biological data, right? So if we think about it in very simple and straightforward terms, psychedelics are very special molecules, because they're molecules, they're very specific molecules that you can pinpoint specific molecular mechanisms on how they act in the brain. So for those of you who are aware of it, for example, how they work in the serotonin 2A receptor system. And the activation of this specific system, possibly together with the activation of other receptor systems, lead to very rich phenomenological experiences. They induce peculiar experiences, which can lead to some phenomena that are very difficult to put into words, right? I would even argue that psychedelics provide a natural form of developing what in phenomenology is called the epoche, a putting in parenthesis of our usual way to relate with the world, in which we are able to re-examine experience or understand experience from a different perspective. We can put in brackets the way that we usually conceive of the world, right? And this, I think, is quite interesting about psychedelics, because once you start speaking with people who use psychedelics, they become more and more interested in what experience is. So it seems as if psychedelics puts people in what you would call a phenomenological disposition of sorts, right? Now that can go in very different ways, and people can interpret that experience in some ways that are good and maybe not that good. But the main tenet is this, that these are very specific molecules that develop into a range of unusual experiences. And because of that, we can think of them as objects of perturbation. So if you want to understand the system, you can perturb that system and see how it reacts to that perturbation. And we can think of psychedelics as a way to perturb this system of consciousness that has a biological side and that has an experiential side, right? So for example, we can induce this perturbation, see how the psychedelics acts on different brain networks that you can see here. And then you can try to assess how that relates to different facets or structural aspects of experience. So the way that we perceive imagery, for example, the way that we conceive bodily perception, and a range of higher order metacognitive functions, or if you will, spiritual type experiences, for example. So we can think of, the classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and mescaline, all, again, specific molecules acting in the serotonin receptor systems, a very specific, straightforward kind of molecular mechanism acting on this specific receptor system in the brain, the serotonin 2A receptor, right? And then this, what we know now, at least the general idea is that we know that this 5-HT2A receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, is present is widely distributed in the brain, but it's also very much densely expressed in the prefrontal cortex, in the temporal cortex, and in the primary visual cortex. So apart from the primary visual cortex, we know that this receptor is situated in, these systems, these evolved brain systems, human-specific systems. And what we know is that when you activate this specific receptor in the brain, it may lead to the release of glutamatergic mechanisms, which is broadly associated to excitation in the brain. So glutamate is this mechanism that generates excitation in synapses and activity of neurons, right? So this 5-HT2A receptor system has a role in a wide range of cognitive functions and leads to various forms of effects. So for example, visual distortions or visual imagery, that can be simple or complex visual imagery. You can think of fractals as simple imagery. You can think of visualization of cities, houses, entities and so on as complex visual imagery, imagery that has some form of semantic content. The hyperassociation of ideas, the possibility of psychedelics to generate various levels of dot connection between, contents that are usually far apart from each other, possibly opening up to this notion that psychedelics also can enhance creative functions. Changes in bodily awareness, people can feel disembodied out of their bodies, or they can feel more connected with their bodily sensations. Time distortions of various kinds. And then we have these more, interesting experiences, more high order kind of experiences, such as mystical type experiences, spiritual experiences, peak experiences, non-dual experiences, experiences of awe, and so on. So various forms of trying to understand specific phenomena. And finally, this phenomena of ego dissolution, the possibility of psychedelics to disrupt the central mechanism of consciousness, the sense of self, right? Again, the idea of perturbation to a specific function of consciousness, in this case, the sense of self, one of the central features of the way that we usually relate and conceive of the world. And this relaxation between the subject-object distinction. So on the one hand, we have these, experiences of wide phenomenological breadth, very diverse, very different experiences. And on the other hand, we have specific brain systems. And from a first subjective point of view, we have that experience, and we can have reports from someone undergoing that experience. And from a third person point of view, we can look at these brain mechanisms. The neuroscientists can use these molecules to perturb the brain and see how the brain reacts. And then in the middle of this, we have what has been called by the philosopher David Chalmers, this explanatory gap. How can we connect the richness of that subjective experience, that mindness, that intimate subjective character of the experience, with those very specific biological mechanisms? And this is somewhat parallel between this idea that on the one hand, we have mental phenomena, we have minds, and on the other side, we have life. And this specific hypothesis that there's a deep continuity between these two poles, between mind and life, right? And this idea posits that somehow some biological systems have some form of cognition, not necessarily consciousness, but that any form of biological system has some form of cognition, and that in more evolved systems, that would express itself as some form of high-level consciousness, like the one that we have. So the idea is that psychedelics would maybe allow us to explore that continuity between mind and life. So what would be, an intriguing example of this? I actually want to take the volume out. So one example, for example, is the case of the visual imagery. When you give DMT to someone, and we've seen this in the lab, fairly reliably, you will see people experiencing some form of geometrical visions, right? They will see geometries, the geometries will be moving, fractals appear commonly. And this not only happens in the lab, but when you see some of the archaeological evidence on societies that have used psychedelics for hundreds of years, you'll see that a lot of the artwork concerns this kind of geometry. It appears to be somewhat of a transcultural phenomena. People taking psychedelics, they close their eyes, geometries will appear, right? And so far, we have no direct evidence of where these geometries are coming from. These have been characterized for quite a long time. So this is Henry Kluwer, who was a researcher I think in the 1920s. He was already characterizing some of these geometrical forms when he was taking mescaline and he was doing phenomenological research. And he characterized them in specific sort of like prototypical characteristics, such as tunnels, spirals, lattices, and cobwebs. So far, we don't know the specific biological mechanisms of this, but the best idea that we have is based on computational modeling that says that, in a way, what is expressing itself is the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex is organized in a topographical fashion, in a geometrical fashion. And in a way, the idea that has been posited in these models is that these visual geometries are expressions of V1. And the idea here is that there's an interesting possibility here to explore via psychedelic experiences this continuity between mind and life, the idea that experience is directly related to these biological phenomena, for example. Another intriguing phenomena within psychedelic experiences that still has not been accounted for is this notion that psychedelics can increase nature connectedness. That when people take psychedelics, over time, it appears to increase trait levels of how connected or how resonant people feel with the natural environment. So research done by Hannes Kettner and colleagues at Imperial has shown that psychedelics in naturalistic settings can increase nature connectedness for over 2 years. And work done by a separate group of researchers led by Matthias Forsman has seen that these increases in nature relatedness can lead to increases in pro-environmental behavior. And the why psychedelics increase this resonance with nature is still not explained. We still don't know very well what is the sort of causal mechanism between these things. Well, one possibility, again, is that somehow psychedelics would provide a modulation in this mind-life continuity so that we can explore the continuity between these two kind of poles or these two kind of ends. So these are interesting sort of ideas with some form of philosophical flavor. But the question remains of how can we explore that continuity between mind and life? So we have this very specific reductionistic biological perspective that we can have on how these molecules work when we look at neuroscience and the way that these molecules act on specific networks in the brain. But how does that link to the intimate subjective character of experience? And one approach that can be taken, and that we have taken and now more researchers are taking when exploring and when studying psychedelic phenomena, concerns with this idea of having a phenomenological approach to these experiences. So taking experience seriously when we're doing these experiments. So instead of us somehow just focusing on these neurobiological phenomena, or maybe even starting from the neurobiological phenomena and then trying to account for experience, we take the opposite direction. So we start from experience, right? So the central tenet here is this lived experiences where we start from and where all must link back like a guiding thread. And instead of eliminating or trying to reduce conscious experience to a brain process, we take a more agnostic position on what is the basis of these experiences. And instead, we start by examining experience and trying to examine it with a disciplined sort of perspective, right? And this is relevant not just for us in our current investigations, but it's also quite relevant when we think about the uses of psychedelics for over hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, depends on what kind of evidence you take into account. Or because the main sort of appeal for this aspect is always this experiential component. And when we think about the current medical applications of psychedelics, the best of the evidence suggests that is it via the experience that these clinical outcomes will happen. So for example, the degree to which people rate these mystical type experiences, these cathartic experiences, or these experiences of psychological insights, the better people will get, right? So there appears to be some form of urgency for us to really understand and come to terms to how this experience unfolds and how it works. So again, if we take a phenomenological disposition, we can think of these molecules as a form of perturbation, perturbing the way that we usually relate to the world, inducing this sort of break, a parenthesis or a discontinuity of experience, the way that we usually relate to the world. And in this parenthesis, something novel or something new emerges. And that can come in the form of a vision, of an insight, or some form of mystical or spiritual revelation, right? So we try to understand these kind of experiences in different fashions. So these are, just an illustrative way to look at these experiences. These are all drawings and sketches from our participants when we've done our DMT neuroimaging studies. And you can see that although we tend to have a sort of idea of what a DMT experience is like, which is a very intense, immersive experience in which people see these entities, these aliens, these beings. When you start looking a bit closer into experience, you'll see that the experience is actually quite diverse. It can be colorful, it can be achromatic, it can be filled with semantic content, or it can be filled with figurative content or a combination of thereof. So what we've done to really come to terms to this richness of experience and try to understand it and systemize it, instead of simply using questionnaires, we started to employ phenomenological techniques. So phenomenology relates to a specific philosophical tradition, which is all about a disciplined inquiry into experience. So we employ this microphenomenology technique in which we try to reduce the way that the biases that come when people try to remember things. We put people in an evocation state so that they can reproduce their experience. And we try to accompany them in that experience in a way that we try to reduce the kind of noise that comes with self-reports, right? So there's a lot of discussions in neuroscience on whether or not we can trust first-person subjective reports. And what we try to do with this interview technique is reduce that bias to some extent. So these are, for example, illustrations of what we've done in our DMT experiments. This is a single subject and this interview process revealing the evolution of different phenomenological features, so different facets of experience and how they evolve over time. So one of the things that this interview process provides as well is providing an analysis of the dynamics of the experience. So thinking of DMT not just as a single sort of thing, a single experience, we think of it now as a series of experiences that evolve over time, and we systemize that evolution via the interview process and the analysis process. So with that, we've been able to draw more information about how the neuroscience relates to that experience, right? So again, the idea of exploring that continuity between mental phenomena and biological phenomena. So for example, we untangled that visual experiences induced by DMT are accompanied by these reductions in alpha waves. Alpha waves are the dominant brain frequency, and the cortical originators of that are in B1, some of them in the visual cortex. And also increases in this delta or low power frequency. Now, these delta waves, I'll show this in a bit, this delta power has now been replicated in subsequent studies in different conditions. And an intriguing part of these delta waves is that appears to be unique to DMT compared to any other psychedelic. And we believe it's very much linked to the degree of immersiveness that people have when they're in this DMT experience. However, at the same time, these delta waves, this power in these lower frequencies, have been classically associated with unconsciousness or with lack of consciousness. And this is a view that has to be, that is, being challenged slowly. And our study has actually provided some of, that challenging data for challenging that original sort of position. And based on our data and other data, this review paper attempts to reconceptualize this sort of specific biological marker, saying that delta power is not a marker for unconsciousness per se, but rather a marker for conscious disconnection. The idea that we can be detached from our immediate surroundings, but still have a degree of immersive or rich experiences, very much in a way what happens during dreaming, or if you will, a form of virtual reality, right? So our rich experiences are now no longer dominated by our surroundings, but instead dominated by what happens inside of us, right? How our own cognitive endogenous systems can bring up a rich experience. And you can see that in some of our specific psychometric data. You can see elevated elementary and complex imagery in this DMT state, while people have this experience of disembodiment no longer being present in the room. So very much like dreaming in a way. So we attempted to also explore this idea of disembodiment, right? So what could be the mechanisms when people are having these immersive DMT experiences? How can this experience come about? And there appears to be a fundamental aspect of how the body seems to be detached from the environment. So if you look at these, again, these microphenomenological analysis, you'll see that when people are having DMT experiences, while at the beginning they have a strong sense of rush in the body, sense of being propelled out via a rocket, for example, that is closely followed by a massive and strong disconnection from the environment, and people feel disembodied. And the precise moment in which this happens is the moment in which the visual imagery comes to be stronger and stronger, when this immersive component of the experience occurs. So it appears that for this immersive character of the phenomenology to occur, people have to be disembodied. And this led us to believe or to hypothesize what could be the kind of mechanisms at the biological level, again, connecting phenomenology with biology, that could lead to these experiences of disembodiment. And one of the things that we thought of is this notion of interoception. So while exteroception has to do with the senses in relationship to the external world, interoception has to do with the senses that have to do with our own biological mechanisms. The mechanisms that allows us to be homeostatic systems and to maintain life via our own processes. So one of the mechanisms that relate to interoception is how our perception of the heart, for example, is regulated at different levels. So, for example, this heartbeat, our experience of the heart appears to be pre-conscious to some extent, and there are specific biological markers in specific brain systems that are related to that sort of like pre-conscious awareness. Occurs mostly in the insula. So we asked the question of whether or not this experience of disembodied that is associated with DMT, whether or not it's linked with these disruptions or perturbations to this interoceptive mechanisms. And whether or not can this be the basis of ego dissolution. So for that, we studied, or we employed something that we could study in the electroencephalogram, the EEG, which is called the heart evoked potential. And the heart evoked potential is essentially a time-locked neurological event that occurs on every heartbeat. So on every heartbeat, you can detect a signal in this brain system, the insula, that is linked to interoceptive awareness, this pre-conscious sort of awareness that we have of our heart beating, right? And we saw that indeed, in line with our hypothesis, DMT disrupts this mechanism of interoceptive awareness in a very significant fashion. So, to provide a very sort of like low-level explanation of this, the red line here is the moment where the heartbeat occurs, and the shaded figure here is the significant time window in which this neural event is blunted in the DMT condition. So we found a very nice confirmation that indeed this interoceptive awareness mechanism, this thing that happens in the insula, is disrupted in people that may be the basis of how people experience disembodiment. So we then look at the sources of this signal. So we employed a technique that allows us to go from the electrodes in the electroencephalogram to what's happening in the actual cortical level, in the cortex. And we found that this effect was localized in the insula as we were hypothesizing, and in the supplementary motor area, which is another system related to interoception. And we found that this reduction of this activation of this neural signal is very much linked both with the experience of disembodiment and also with the experience of ego dissolution, providing some form of evidence, again, that this sense of self that we carry in our daily experiences, that we take for granted, this sense of, of identity that we have, although we feel it's unitary, although we feel that it's stable, what cognitive neuroscience shows us is that you can break it down into different parts. A bodily part, a part that's related to identity, for example, and that DMT appears to disrupt selectively some of those parts. In this case, the part of bodily awareness. Again, the idea that we can use psychedelics to perturb central aspects of conscious experience, in this case, the sense of self, in a very significant and radical fashion. So, other work that we've done with this substance, and these are submitted work that we still haven't published, but might be of interest to you, is how this DMT works when it's given inside of neuroimaging conditions, in this case, fMRI, right? So we looked at how different networks in the brain lead to these very unusual experiences. And we see that DMT works in a very peculiar fashion by integrating connectivity between networks in the brain, more specifically the higher order networks. So for example, the default mode network that you might have heard of, which concerns, again, as a central form of mechanism that relates to self-related processing to a certain extent, but also other cognitive functions when we're not attending to the external environments. And also the frontoparietal systems related to decision-making, for example, with the rest of the brain, while at the same time reducing connectivity between lower level networks. So we see that there's these high-level networks become hyper-connected, while these sensory systems become disconnected between each other. And we see, when you look at the brain at a broad level, that is these, again, these evolved brain functions, the ones that are more than brain functions, brain systems in the prefrontal cortex, temporal cortex, that become hyper-connected with the rest of the brain. And we see that indeed these high-level systems, this hyperconnectivity in these high-level systems, are the one that are very much related to increases in this delta waves that, again, were classically conceived to be some form of marker of unconsciousness, but here we see that may be better conceived as a marker for conscious disconnection, reductions in alpha waves, and entropy. And these results in entropy are actually quite interesting. We see entropy is essentially a way of seeing how unpredictable the brain signal is with EEG. And we found that with EEG, these levels of entropy are related to hyperconnectivity in left lateralized language systems. And indeed, when we look more closely at the kind of systems in the brain that become hyperconnected, and when you look closely at the kind of brain systems that are related to the location of this serotonin 2A or 5-HT2A receptor, you'll see that the functions are very much related to human-specific, highly semantic functions. For example, those related to language, theory of mind, the attribution of mind to other people, comprehension, and semantics. And this brain on the right that you see here is work mapping the degree to which abstract semantic concepts are processed in different brain areas compared to concrete semantic concepts. And what we see is that DMT appears to act more specifically on abstract semantic processing in the brain. And the way that we can somehow interpret this is that DMT, as well with other psychedelics, or we've seen at least also with LSD and psilocybin, is that they act in the brain systems that are related to abstract semantic processing, facilitating the generation of novel concepts, meaning and mentalization, or attributing minds to others. And if you think about it, it's intriguing in a way, the idea or the notion that psychedelics are acting on evolved cognitive systems. If we think of evolved cognitive systems, these are the cognitive systems that relate to imagination, counterfactual thinking, or our storytelling abilities, right? And if we think of this, virtual reality idea of psychedelics, it's very much consistent with this notion. The idea is that psychedelics generate a virtual space by acting on our semantic systems to generate these worlds of experience, these rich phenomenological experiences that are detached from our immediate surroundings. And here, I think, is where we can draw important inferences also on the clinical applications of these substances. So if we know that the 5-HT2A receptor is primarily located in this sort of evolved cognitive systems, these storytelling systems, and we see that hyperconnectivity in the brain is induced when giving psychedelics in these evolved cognitive human-specific systems, then we are provided with this notion that these experiences provide a window of opportunity for what you might call transformation, clinical change, reductions in depression, increases in well-being, and so on. But that this window of opportunity is not necessarily a beneficial one. So when we think about plasticity in the brain and we think about increases in connectivity, changes in the brain are not necessarily optimal. You can think of, when people are sunk into some form of depression, you can think that connectivity is also changing in the brain. The brain is actually rewiring itself, but in a non-beneficial fashion. So what counts as beneficial here is how the context acts together with the substance, right? So the substance biases the system, the brain, to some form of rewiring, to some form of hyperconnectivity. But the specifics of that rewiring is depending on context. And that context very much depends on the physical setting, the characteristics of the patient or the psychedelic user, the actions of the therapist, in this case, if this is a clinical context. And this leads again to the notion or to the idea of what are some of the ethical sort of consequences of this notion of plasticity in the brain induced by psychedelics. So what we've seen in some of our work is that psychedelics can change the views that one person has concerning the nature of reality. That could be good or bad, depending on who you ask. The important thing is that this has to do primarily with issues of consent. So people undergoing these experiences are not necessarily asking for having their worldviews changed, right? And this is very much depending, again, on the idea of a strong perturbation to the brain and mind. Some of our work has also shown that some of these psychological insights can be hard to verify for people. People can have a re-experiencing of a traumatic event that they thought was repressed, that they didn't know they had. But it can be also hard for people to verify whether or not that experience actually happened. It could be troubling for people to really come to terms to these insights if they cannot be really verified. Or we can think of forms of spiritual bypassing or spiritual escapism that leads sometimes to the long-term use of psychedelics or even the short-term use of psychedelics. It's not uncommon to hear people undergoing these experiences with some form of refreshed perspective on what life is or on what spirituality is, and disregard in very significant ways their own personal lives, the relationships, and the kind of challenges that we face on day-to-day life that need to be taken into account. So based on these sort of ideas, the notion that psychedelics induce profound experiences, and these profound experiences are somehow related to plasticity of brain function, maybe plasticity of brain structure, and that this plasticity can lead into very many different directions, could be positive, could be negative. We were wondering to what extent this notion that this perturbation in the mind and in the brain can lead to a lasting change in the way people relate to their ideas of reality or metaphysical beliefs, the fundamental nature of reality. So we were interested in this specifically because we know to a certain extent, if you look at the anthropological evidence, that psychedelics play a role in the development of cosmovisions or worldviews in different communities. You can think of communities in the Amazon jungle taking ayahuasca in which the cosmovision is very much related to the use of ayahuasca to access a spiritual world, an animistic worldview in which the natural world is dominated by spirits. Or you can think of, for example, the ayahuasca churches such as Santo Daime, which its central sacrament is the use of ayahuasca. It's a way to have a direct experience with what they consider, deities or gods. We can think of the kind of mystical type experiences provided by psychedelics as a way to change these metaphysical worldviews. The idea of accessing some form of true reality that is beyond the veil. That's a common sort of like meme, I think. Or ego dissolution experiences that can have a very fundamental impact on worldviews. A classic example of this, I think, is what happened in the counterculture in the 1960s, in the 1960s and 70s in the US and Europe. That is very much linked to the discovery or invention of LSD. So LSD, when LSD was discovered during the Second World War, there was no cultural context around the use of that substance. So if you compare it, for example, with ayahuasca or psilocybin, you can think that there, in those contexts, people knew how to handle the substance with varying degrees of expertise, right? So they knew that it had to be given in a particular setting. And that ritual setting containing that experience, containing the impact of that experience. In some societies, ayahuasca can even be a form to get people together closer to society rather than disrupting society. So the discovery in LSD in the 1940s was a chemical invention in which there was no set and setting, cultural set and setting for that experience. That generating in a big way this kind of events that led even to this countercultural sort of happening in the 1960s. Again, linked with the idea that reality can be different, that the world can be different, right? A changing worldviews with a cultural impact. And you can think of how specific revelations occurring during the psychedelic experiences or experiences of insight lead to these kind of changes in beliefs. And you can look at phenomenological examples of that in these books, for example. So Sacred Knowledge, the work of Bill Richards and his work in Maryland over the last 50 years now, maybe even 60 years. The work of Stanislav Grof and his clinical work using LSD. And this excellent book that I really recommend, The Antipodes of the Mind, by Benny Shannon, which is all about charting the phenomenology of ayahuasca experiences. Again, detailing the way how these insights occurring during the psychedelic experience leads to these revelations, which then leads to these changes in worldviews. So Benny Shannon, classic, I don't know if classically, because I don't know if it's this well known, this book, but in his book, you can see how he is a hardcore cognitive scientist, a reductionist cognitive scientist and atheist. And he says after taking ayahuasca all these many times, he can no longer say he's an atheist. So the hypothesis in mind is that these psychedelic insights, they lead to these changes in worldviews. But there's a specific quality, a phenomenological characteristic of this insight that leads to these transformations. And this has to do with this so-called noetic quality. Right? So William James talks about this noetic quality. Although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seem to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. They are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. They are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance. All unarticulate though they remain, and as a rule, they carry with them a curious sense of authority for aftertime. The notion is this noetic quality of the insight is that it's not filtered by any form of mediation, right? It's like an eureka, an aha moment that comes during these experiences. And that quality of aha, of unmediation, gives that information, that knowledge, some form of impact or weight that can lead to these transformational worldviews. So what we found when we studied different metaphysical positions, different metaphysical beliefs, we found a specific effect of psychedelics increasing beliefs in non-physicalist worldviews, right? So a worldview that reduces all mental phenomena into biological or into physical phenomena appears to be rejected after a single psychedelic use. So we followed up on people going to ceremonies, and we saw how the worldview changed. And after 6 months, people were still, showing a rejection to these physicalist beliefs. We saw that lifetime use of psychedelics is directly linked to rejecting this notion of physicalism. And we also saw that there was a direct association between non-physicalist beliefs and increases in well-being. Somewhat of a mild correlation, but nonetheless an association. And at the same time, we saw that these changes in metaphysical beliefs were linked to changes in spiritual bypassing or spiritual escapism. So changes in beliefs associated to well-being and also at the same time to spiritual escapism, leading to this notion that we can think of psychedelic experiences as a double-edged sword, right? They can provide benefits, but also forms of what we think could be distressful, forms of spiritual escapism. Also, when we looked at this kind of psychological mechanism that were associated to these changes in metaphysical beliefs, we found that contextual variables were significant in influencing the way that these beliefs were changing. Among them, we found characteristics of the individual, such as gender, age, and how much they were conforming to peers, so linked to the idea of suggestibility, and acute variables occurring during the experience. So more specifically, how much people felt emotionally connected with other ceremony participants, also very much linked to this notion of changing your beliefs of the nature of reality. So these social psychological variables having a significant influences in how people were changing their worldviews. Again, the double-edged sword here, opening up the possibility that psychedelics somehow provide a flexible or a plastic mind for belief transmission, or even to some extent brainwashing. Because of these reasons, we developed this kind of framework. Who everyone is interested can read about it, which we called Psychedelic Apprenticeship. Is how can we, in a way, navigate this double-edged sword of psychedelics, these very subtle states of consciousness, so that they can remain ethical in a way, right? And what we think is central in this experience is how we can develop awareness of our own minds and how they change during this experience, right? So this is the process that we call apprenticeship. And more than this happening at the individual level of, let's say, the psychonaut or the psychedelic user, we think that this is important to happen at a relational level, right? So we can think of integration circles as an important instance in which these kind of insights are negotiated. And the exchange happening in these integration circles can be very useful. We think of, for example, the actions of a therapist and the training of a therapist as a crucial form of psychedelic apprenticeship to mediate and negotiate these insights in an ethical fashion. The good psychedelic therapist is someone that has gone through those pitfalls of the experience, the difficulties of that experiences, and can help others in guiding them in that way. So we think this idea of empathic resonance is fundamental for, these psychedelic experiences to remain to some degree ethical. And this is a really kind of like last minute idea or hypothesis based on these kind of data and this kind of conceptual work, is that psychedelics appear to provide a modulation, if you will, of believing the experiences as face value, or deconstructing the experiences to a maximum extent, right? So for examples, in the extreme case of absorption, the psychedelic experience is believed as such. I have gone through the DMT experience, and it has revealed to me that entities or deities that are no longer consistent with this reality are actually more real than real. And this is the true nature of reality. So this would be a position of subjective realism. And we can think of this as what happens when people also have psychedelic delusions, or people have bad trips and paranoias that are very fixed and rigid and believed as true. Or in the long term, we can think of phenomena such as spiritual bypassing or spiritual escapism, in which the idea of the spiritual specific phenomena becoming so reified, so crystallized and so real that the normal sort of dilemmas and challenges that we face in life are neglected and dissociated from our worldviews, right? And the kind of like the prototypical statement here is that the psychedelic experience revealed to me the truth, right? On the other end, psychedelic experiences can provide a form of deconstruction of how we usually understand experience. They can provide a form of, again, phenomenological break or parenthesis in how we negotiate with our day-to-day lives that can lead us to deconstruct the nature of experience. And we can think of healthy ways in which this can happen, for example, in the acute experience of ego dissolution, in which one realizes that one is not its job, one is not its trauma, and one is not, any sort of identity or fixed identity that they thought they had, but they realize that, the idea of identity or the sense of self is a dynamic, impermanent sense of self that is constantly under construction. Or we can think of moments of integration in which these insights that occur during the psychedelic experience can become deconstructed and reconstructed in dynamic ways. And the statement, the prototypical statement that we can associate with this is that psychedelics reveal to me that experience is a construction. So we suspend our naive reality conceptions that we have of experience, this idea that we take the world for granted and we take it as a real object. And when we perturb the system with the substances and we have these hallucinations or we have this modification in our visual system, in our cognitive systems, in our metacognitive systems, we realize that this experience can be modified, can be different, right? And deconstructed. And where the people will be at during the psychedelic experience or outside the psychedelic experience will depend very much, again, on the kind of practice that people have around the experience. So some people are now talking about not only psychedelics and setting, but also the idea of skill set, right? How the psychedelic users start to develop the kind of skills required to navigate this experience in a healthy, deep, and meaningful fashion. Right. And again, if you think about this from a clinical perspective, for some people to be in this absorption state might be quite helpful for a while. But over time, it might be useful for them to go to a more deconstructive side of how they interpret that experience. So having as well a dynamic sense, a temporal dynamic sense of how they situate themselves along this absorption and deconstruction continuum. So if we say that, let's take that position of deconstruction. Let's say that we cannot really count on the psychedelic experience to reveal something fundamental about the nature of reality, but we do know they can change our beliefs about that. Well, can they tell us something fundamental about consciousness, right? And one way that we can look into that, or one way in which I think psychedelics can tell us something meaningful about consciousness, is when we think about the embodied and embedded character of our subjective experience of consciousness, right? So again, when we think about the usual naturalistic, reductionistic approach, we tend to link experience and consciousness only to the brain. and what some of the work of people like Varela, Thompson, and Roche, or even Gregory Bateson, what they emphasize in their work is that actual conscious experience is actually an embedded system that is related to the outside world, that is related to the body as well. So the idea of the embodied and the embedded mind. And when we think of psychedelics as being highly context dependent, we can think of as well a manifestation of the context dependent nature of mind or of consciousness. And I think here is an obvious opportunity of how psychedelics can tell us something meaningful about how mind works or how consciousness works. And this leads us as well, I think, to my current interests and the current kind of research that we're kind of pursuing, which is about the investigation of the embodied self around psychedelics and the disruption of the sense of the embodied sense of self, and how ego dissolution induced by psychedelics can be an interesting way to approach this, right? Again, the idea here is that according to some theories in cognitive neuroscience, the sense of self is a dynamic entity. Although we tend to think of it as a fixed thing that is stable over time and defines us, the sense of self is actually changing over and over again in time, constructing and deconstructing moment to moment. And that specific sort of subjective, intimate experience that we have about our sense of self apparently related to continuous microdynamics of neural activity. Neuronal ensembles which are constantly constructing and deconstructing moment to moment. Again, the idea of embodying this form of emptiness consistent with some form of Buddhist traditions, right? That the sense of self is actually impermanent, although it feels permanent, although it feels continuous, right? And one way that we're interested in investigating this in current trials, in current studies, is by comparing DMT and 5-MeO-DMT at the phenomenological subjective level and also at the biological or neurological level, right? So if we think of it, about these two kind of experiences, we see that the DMT is a very rich experience. It has a lot of contents. And when we think about the 5-MeO-DMT experience, from a sensorial perspective, it seems to be quite contentless. It has very little elementary imagery compared to DMT. And instead, while the DMT appears to show reduced scores of ego dissolution to some extent, the 5-MeO-DMT appears to be very much about ego dissolution and about deconstructing the sense of self. So these are word clouds associated with both kind of experiences. This is all from Reddit. And while you can see in the concept cloud of DMT, concepts such as entity and sensing different things, in the concept cloud of 5-MeO-DMT, you see vastness, space, surrendering, and so on. So 5-MeO-DMT appears to deconstruct the sense of self. Maybe 5-MeO-DMT can allows us to access minimal forms of consciousness, breaking down the form of consciousness to some form of fundamental level. I'll take your question right away. And this includes the sense of self and ego. And one of the things that at least I've found in the literature that's quite interesting is that extreme meditation states, such as non-dual meditation, also has to do with some form of radical deconstruction of experience or the sense of self to its minimal components. The idea that you're somehow reducing the complexity of the models, as you can see in this kind of figure here, to some form of minimal components, according to the depth of meditation. So if 5-MeO-DMT and acute meditation states both provide this form of model complexity reduction, right? Reducing the experience to some form of minimal components, then maybe these kind of experiences can tell us something meaningful, valuable, and maybe fundamental about the nature of experience. And maybe also how we can understand and practice better our place in the world. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Yeah. Do you want to start, Sebastian?
First of all, thank you very much for an extremely interesting and very engaging talk throughout. I had a question about interoception, because I actually had the opposite hypothesis that interoception would be enhanced by psychedelic use. First, is it specific to DMT? And second, is interoceptive processing disrupted in the sense that it is diminished, or in the sense that, like how, for example, vision is disrupted but also amplified?
This is a good question. So one of the, I think interoception is modulated in the acute psychedelic experience. So it can go up or down depending on the substance, maybe even depending on set and setting. But at least when it comes to DMT, I think there's a specificity around it when the dose is high enough, right? And also the temporal dynamics are important. So what we found in our phenomenological analysis is that in the first minute, people feel their bodies much more, right? So they feel that there's this vibration in their bodies and there's some form of, feedback mechanisms about their bodily states, which appears to be quite enhanced. But that is followed by a strong sense of disembodiment. So it's all about where in time you look at. That's the kind of idea. And if the dose is high enough, at least we see that this embodiment is quite pronounced. And the second question, if this happens also with visual experiences? Okay. So I think I think it's very much depending on substance, so the dynamics of the experience, and maybe in the person. So when you look at 5-MeO DMT experiences and the kind of things that people are experiencing when they're having underground therapy, a lot of it has to do with this kind of like bodily sort of intensification of experiences that are related to their past trauma, for example. So I think one of the things that we kind of like should move on now that we're looking more closely into the psychedelic experience is try to think of things at the individual level as well. So for some people, people can have this embodiment. For other people, that body parts can have more or stronger effects. And this is very much related to the notion that the effects of psychedelics are somewhat unpredictable and context dependent and individual dependent. So I think, when thinking about the psychedelic experience, although we can have fixed invariant features of experiences across people, I think what we will learn more and more and more, and this will be very obvious in clinical practice, is that we will have a more subject-centered, specific, personalized approach, both to research and to practice. Yeah, I mean, I think.
So if you could just summarize the question for the recording, because you don't have the microphone.
Sure, yeah. So what about extreme athletes? What happens with their interoception? That's the gist of the question. And then I don't know. I mean, I think maybe people with a lot of clinical practice will know a bit better. In our experiments, I haven't seen anything specific of that, but also I haven't really investigated it with much detail. So we'll see.
Yes, thanks a lot for the interesting talk. So you mentioned how the setting affects the experience, and I'm thinking that current research, the context is very different from like traditional ceremonial settings. So do you think we're missing out on insights, or is there a benefit to studying psychedelics in different contexts?
100%. I mean, I think this is one of the interesting things when doing interdisciplinary research with anthropologists, which is all about context, right? So the way science works, it attempts to isolate variables to kind of average out context, broadly speaking. Because psychedelics reveal the context-dependent nature of mind, that it's always there anyway. Everything's are always context-dependent, just become more context-dependent, the effects of psychedelics compared to other drugs. I think because of that, it also pushes research to come out of the lab. And there's a lot of interesting naturalistic research happening more and more. And I won't be surprised if we see, like experiments coming out of shamans getting electrodes in the jungle, in ayahuasca ceremonies. I've actually thought about that many times. We might do it actually soon, yeah.
Thank you. It was really interesting. You showed this and made a lot of, put a lot of emphasis on keeping apart what can be learned and what cannot be learned from psychedelics, and also how they affect actually people's beliefs and metaphysical beliefs. Do you think there's any danger that the people who are conducting the research on psychedelics might actually be brainwashed, and that this could be a potential problem?
So the question is whether or not researchers doing the research could also be brainwashed. Why? Why do you think?
I mean, my assumption, which I didn't explicitly say it, is that people who dedicate their research to psychedelics very likely have taken or are taking psychedelics regularly, which then could affect their beliefs and maybe infiltrate their objectivity.
Right, yeah. So the question is that you think that, so the possibility that you're positing here is that psychedelic researchers might be biased because they may have psychedelic experiences of their own. It could be the case. I think a lot of people doing research have personal experiences at varying degrees with their object of studies. So maybe, people go into depression, they may have a loved one who has depression, depressive symptomatology, and you can think that that can develop a passion, and that could be good. It could also bias their view of what depression is about and their theories and the way they conceptualize and maybe even analyze the data. I think in general, my position on it would be that more than try to do away with bias is become aware of bias. And I think, again, this comes back to the notion of honing psychedelic practices and awareness of how these biases develop in the way that people do their own sort of research. I think that is an important aspect. The other important aspect is the peer review system, having a solid sort of way in which we validate information across researchers and across disciplines as well. But I agree, it is potentially a form of bias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for the beautiful lecture. I have a rather boring or technical question. I mean, modeling experience employing linear scale is very hard, right? So especially if we are talking about peak experiences and all that comes to it, disembodiment, ego dissolution. I mean, just the mere, fact how it is formulated on scale from 0 to 100, right? How much your ego was dissolved I think it's, it's hard to study it employing linear scales. And, actually at some of the plots that you showed, it seems like two people who didn't have the disembodiment experience and the rest, just had it was very skewed towards the highest ratings. So while I was curious, and also in relation to the previous questions that were asked about the effects of psychedelics on bodily feelings, have you? On the embodiment experience, the somatosensory experiences. Because, have you considered employing the nonlinear ways of looking at that? Because, it's a strong assumption that there is a linear relationship. The higher the dose, the more disembodiment you have. And specifically speaking about the history of psychedelics were used as an augment for therapy, right? So there are relatively small doses, enhancing susceptibility of clients or patients towards psychotherapeutic interventions. And there is a psychedelic framework of psychedelic therapy that were aimed to induce these peak experiences that I think are much harder to quantify. Yeah. So, to cut the long story short, the question is, have you considered employing the nonlinear way to estimate it? Maybe it's, instead of assuming the linear relationship, maybe well, they just act differently in different dosages?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So the question is whether or not we should put all in a single scale sometimes when it comes to this embodiment, whereas we can think of different multidimensional categories and so on. I think we've definitely thought of it. I mean, one of the ways in which we have thought of it and have started to do, the kind of quantification around experiences is breaking down what is usually conceived as one experience into several experiences. So you can think of, for example, the idea of ego dissolution. The sense of self, you can classically kind of divide it, if you do proper analysis, between a minimal sense of self, which is the embodied sense of self, or a sense of kind of like high-level identity, right? So I am Chris, for example, right? And I am Chris is the high-level, this is my body, how the body feels about my aboutness in the body is my kind of like embodied or minimal self. And I think that kind of breakdown is an initial way to start thinking about, well, then instead of one category, you now have two categories. And then you can start thinking of these as separate sort of entities to a certain extent. So that could be one way you kind of like separate things out. The other thing that you could do is really start to think about neuroscience more at the individual level. Instead of trying to average out inter-individual variability, you start doing these kind of associations between, neurological phenomena and experiential phenomena at the individual level. Right?
Asking you to consider is just, instead of looking at the linear scale, that there is a continuity in the relationship, say, between changes in the delta waves and the magnitude of the disembodiment experience. Maybe there is a threshold level, after which, you see no difference, for instance, or before that threshold level, actually, there could be the opposite effects.
Right, like non-linear relationship, essentially that. So you could fit a curve, but it's just a curve, it's not a line, maybe, something like that. Could be. I mean, I really think that there's a lot to do here, and if you have specific ideas, we can talk about them later on, about like specific ways to think about it. But again, it's a challenge, and this is why doing microphenomenology and doing neurophenomenology has been kind of like, it's attractive for many researchers in neuroscience, but it's hard to implement precisely because of these kind of problems.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to ask about when you ask the subjects about their experiences, when do you do this? Like, how close after they actually come off it do you ask again? Like, do you ask multiple times? Do you also ask later? Does it change?
Yes, good question. So when we do this kind of analysis, the microphenomenology analysis, this is an interview that occurs right after the experience is over. I mean, with DMT, we can kind of get away with this kind of things because it's a bolus infusion, it's short, fast, and it comes up in 2 minutes and it's over in 20 minutes, completely over in 20 minutes. So right after that experience, what we do is we do at least an hour-long interview in which we kind of like recreate the scene. We ask people to put themselves in the same bodily position as they were before the experience happened. We put the eye mask back in, and we, prompt them to tell about the experience in the first person and in the present tense. So right now I'm feeling this in my arm. Right now I feel my body tingling and vibrating, and then and so on and so on. And then the interview process is like this very iterative process in which you go back and forth and really try to help people guide through the progression of that experience. So that's when we do it, right after the experience, and we have an hour afterwards. Given the kind of resources that we have, we don't have it to really interview them again and see what happens if their recollection or re-evocation changes again after that initial recollection.
Hi, thank you for a great lecture. I just wonder, I didn't get really what was the difference between this DMT and 5-MeO DMT?
So the question is, what's the difference between DMT and 5-MeO DMT? And this is mostly gathered from people, doing this in naturalistic settings and the kind of research that's been done there. But the intuition and what kind of the data is preliminary showing is that DMT appears to be an experience filled with content, right? People have these DMT experiences, they have vivid visual imagery, they have strong feelings in the body, they have strong emotional feelings as well. And they are immersed in a world many times, and that world appears to be populated by beings, entities, or it's filled with cathedrals, skies, cities, and so on. Just filled with contents, right? This is a rich, contentful experience. Whereas 5-MeO DMT, at least what the preliminary data says, appears to be very much devoid of content, right? And people say that they experience a form of whiteout in which no longer they can tell about objects in their experience, but they achieve the state of sort of minimal consciousness, in which the only kind of experience that people have is about consciousness itself. It's kind of like hard to get one's head around it, but that's kind of like the essential idea. So when you do, in neuroscience, you're interested in kind of double dissociations many times, right? And this could be an interesting sort of double dissociation, right? And DMT, you have an experience that is filled with content and in which the sense of self is kind of preserved to a certain extent. And in the 5-MeO DMT, you have an experience of no content and no sense of self.
Okay, so you mentioned that DMT is associated with a hyper-connected connectivity in high-level networks and hypo-connectivity in low-level networks. And I can imagine that the experiential or phenomenological correspondence for the hyperconnectivity would be something like apophenia, or like a merger of concepts, or a hyper-associative state of mind. But what would you say that the phenomenological correspondence to hypoconnectivity in low-level networks would be?
Yeah, so what we've seen that is between specifically the visual network and the somatomotor network. And the thing that comes to mind is, precisely that you have a state of disembodiment while people are highly immersed in a sort of visual experience, right? In which the sensory motor systems are de-afferentiated from the external world, but the sensory visual system is very much engaged. Does that make sense?
It does. Do you see the same hypoconnectivity between, say, low-level visual and low-level auditory areas? I'm asking also because, like, it feels a little bit counterintuitive, given like that the psychedelics are associated with synesthetic states of mind.
Yeah, I know. It's a good point. We haven't, the way that we split the brain to do this connectivity analysis, we don't have an auditory network, but we might do this kind of analysis in the future and see if there's something specific about the auditory areas. Now, again, I think this is also very subject specific. Like when we were doing interviews, I saw people that were having a lot of visual experiences with this sort of high-pitched thing happening in the DMT experience, and people having sometimes no auditory whatsoever, even to the point in which they no longer heard the scanner noise from the fMRI. So, I really think that this is interesting because these are very strong sensory effects that can be highly variable between individuals, to the point of, shutting down a complete sensory system or turning the volume up to the same system between individuals.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for a great talk. This kind of relates to the last question as well. You mentioned that you find hyperconnectivity during the acute DMT state and sort of hypoactivity in like lower network regions. So I'm wondering, have you done any analysis on connectome specific harmonic waves in this? And sort of more specifically, if you apply that to do regional specific harmonic waves? Because we seem to find that there's like the higher frequency bands give sort of very local activity.
Yeah, so the data sits with Selena Atasoy for that, and Jakub. I don't know if you know Jakub or students. So I did presented work, like some results like 2 years ago, but I don't know where that ended up with. I can't remember the results from the top of my mind, but maybe you can find an email to tell you later on about it.
Yeah. I hear you talk about the setting, the therapists. You mentioned trauma. You mentioned the relational aspect. To me, sometimes the therapeutic part of this seems a little bit like a black box. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you guys are actually working with, like, what qualifications, what type of people do you have running this? And also, how do you see the evolvement of the therapeutic side of this?
Right. I think it's an excellent question. The question is about the therapy, kind of like the therapy actions, the therapy context, the frameworks, etc. How is it happening in the context of psychedelic therapy? So I actually concentrate mostly on the neuroscience part of it and the consciousness research part of it, but I have dabbled a bit into ideas around therapy. The way that it works in our lab is that it follows the classic, at least the setting of it is the classic sort of framework of two co-therapists, very little intervention, just providing psychological support, and only when it's needed, the therapist kind of pushes the participants to go deeper when they need to go deeper. And the music playing a central role in this whole thing, right? Like the music as this kind of hidden therapist, guiding the emotional storyline of this experience. And that happens for pragmatic research questions as well. So you want to try to minimize the kind of interventions that happen in research, or at least have the same kind of interventions in a control condition as you would do in your psilocybin condition, in which people are having the psychedelic therapy. Now, because of issues of masking the blind and the issues of control, if people are clearly in a psilocybin experience, the actions of the therapist will become much stronger, and therefore, you're kind of messing up your, intervention. Now, we all kind of know that the blind is broken mostly in these studies, so the reliability of the studies when compared to control conditions is still to be determined, and therefore the interventions tend to be minimal. Now, what the kind of work that I'm interested in, and I've done more on it, and this relational kind of aspects, concerns of how to structure or how to think about, these kind of elements when we think about the implementation of psychedelic therapy in larger sort of contexts, or within a classic sort of biomedical pharmacological context, right? So it's re-emphasizing again the idea of set and setting, re-emphasizing in a very strong fashion the skill set of the therapists to a very strong extent, and the preparation of the therapist, right? And the aspect that I'm interested, because I'm interested in this notion of phenomenology, is how we can develop a phenomenological disposition for both participants and for the facilitators and the therapists. And the central idea is that this does not come about in a simple-minded fashion. It does not come about with a manual, but it requires embodied practice. It requires falling down the pitfalls and getting up again, and understanding how to navigate that complicated sort of boat. So it's more like a conceptual sort of framework, the kind of things that I'm interested in. Yeah, so in the research context, it has to be a psychiatrist, kind of like the lead therapist, and then a psychologist accompanying the process as a co-therapist. There is some training in which we do at Imperial, to support that process around the principles of psychedelic therapy. And there's some form of experiential session with holotropic breathwork in different times. Yeah, that's the kind of training. There's no formal, training, like the one that they have in MAPS. It's formal to a certain extent, but it's not certified. And I think that this is the issue of the field at large. Nobody knows what kind of certification will be the valid ones when this becomes a publicly available thing. But I think this is kind of the main challenge that the field is faced with now when it comes to therapy and when it comes to the commercialization of this at larger scale. How are therapists going to be qualified? Do you have any specific opinions on it?
Trained at California Institute of Integral Studies. I mean, I have and has kind of a connections into the California kind of underground work with these type of substances, and it seems like my colleagues that are into this, they're using quite a lot of the skill sets from somatic therapists, and it's very much about, first of all, having your own nervous system well regulated to be able to provide a regulated setting for the client, and then understanding how to actually deal with traumatic material that is surfacing, and also having the own capacity to actually not dissociate, but actually be able to be present when things comes about.
Yeah, I what I like about the somatic thing, which is very much in line with the idea of an embodied mind, but also the idea that you look at the body to ground the process. And from what you're saying, there's a lot of like transferential and counter-transferential issues that are addressed always via the body. So it seems to be a nice, maybe very literal sort of metaphor of the kind of interactions that happen. So it seems quite unique. I'd love to at some point train as one of these things, but I don't have time. But I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, thanks for a great lecture. My question is kind of in the same idea. What kind of unique benefits do you see regarding DMT compared to psilocybin therapy, ketamine therapy, MDMA therapy? Is there any unique applications that you can see for the future, specifically for DMT, as it is quite different from, well, they are all different, but
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't found anything. I don't have an intuition about any sort of specificity of indications for DMT compared to other substances. I think right now, I mean, I do see differences between ketamine possibly and the classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD and DMT. And I think a lot of it has to do with dissociation in ketamine, right? So it's a different broad pharmacological mechanism. And that this experience of dissociation appears to be very central. So I think my intuition is that ketamine works differently to a certain extent, not radically different, but differently. It's still, this idea of experience providing the kind of transformations or playing a big role in transformations. But as far as DMT compared to psilocybin and LSD, I think the difference to explore things, if there are differences, are all about how do we do infusions of DMT. Right now we're exploring with continuous infusions of DMT and changing the infusion parameters, and we're able to stabilize people to a fair extent, how long they are in that experience. And, I think it's a very reasonable, plausible argument that if you lower the dose of DMT and keep people in a steady state, you might have a very similar thing as a psilocybin experience. So the specificity of the kind of things, I'm very skeptical until, you know, proven otherwise. I think, you know, we need more data and we need more on how do we administer the drugs and the doses to really figure out how they are different. Now, this is of course different from ayahuasca, right? Ayahuasca has other compounds, has an emetic sort of component in it, which seems to be very central for the therapeutic component as well, the purging. So yeah, but when it comes to the classic psychedelics, I don't know.
This has been the best Friday night in a long time for me. If we get you to stick around until the 25th of May, perhaps we can make you stay for quite a long time. Then you can learn from another person coming who's training psychedelic therapists. And then that's a shout out to you. On 25th of May, Dia Stenbacken will come here. So we'll do whatever we can to keep you in Sweden.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a link as well to the talk? Okay.
Sorry?
Can you get an online link in case I can stay?
Sure, yeah, we will.
Yeah, thanks.
You just have to join our network.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so back to the hyper connectivity. I was wondering if you had thought about maybe incorporating previous history of the experience of the substance as a moderator of the connectivity. So that maybe you see more of the hyper connectivity between the networks in participants that have several previous experiences with the substance. Or what's your thoughts about that?
It's a good idea. Could be. Maybe the brain is being trained, you know, progressively in these experiences, and then yeah, you'll see a more loosened mind prepared to be more loosened on the subsequent experience. I think it requires thoughts and a proper hypothesis to do that. But I think it, you know, it's definitely a plausible thing, and it could be easily tested. So,
because it could be my prejudice, but these kind of studies tend to attract previous users or not naive participants. Or am I correct in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interacting things here, and definitely we when we take it to the fMRI scanner, we do it with experienced people because it's a very intense experience because of safety. But at the same time, you can hear novices having the most wild experiences on it, and seeing the most experienced people being very bored by the experience. So I don't know where there's a lot of intervening factors, and this is where, you know, modeling set and setting comes to mind and comes to really thinking about how it all changes in this regard. So I'd say, you know, it requires a lot of thought of how this kind of hypothesis could be implemented, but it could be the case to a certain extent. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question related to the last slide of the presentation, where you talked about the similarity between the experience of 5-MeO DMT and some non-dualistic meditation practices, and that the similarity between them could tell us valuable things about consciousness and our place in the world and so on. And I was wondering, like, since we can see the similarity between these types of experiences, do you think there is any value in using like the established knowledge and literature stemming from some of these non-dualistic traditions, since, like, for psychedelics, the established literature and so on is very young compared to something like Buddhism, which has a lot since it's much older, and both pertaining to like using psychedelics as a way of personal exploration and transformation, and also perhaps how to approach therapeutic practice. Do you think there's any value to basing your attitudes or like approaches on any of this established cultural background? Even though I know both in many non-dualistic traditions and in like praxis for psychedelics, it's a lot about like letting the experience speak for itself, right? But since there is no good existing framework like that for like modern psychedelic use, for ways of like personal integration and so on, do you think this has any value?
It's a very good question. The question is whether or not we can use existing frameworks within Buddhism to a certain extent to, harness, meaningful, deep, and safe psychedelic practice in different contexts, like clinical contexts and maybe even psychoanalytic contexts. I don't know. Yes, I mean, I think one of the important things that comes to mind more than the literature itself is the notion of lineage. And when it comes to practice around states of consciousness, like I mentioned with this notion of apprenticeship, the relational aspect of having a mentor, a guide, someone guiding that process in an optimal ways is very important. And why that is important is not, the main point here is that know-how, is something that you build with practice, right? And Buddhism, like different traditions within Buddhism, it's all about practicing. There can be texts, although some traditions say, you need to burn all the texts and practice. But the main idea of the relational component there is to how to scaffold practice and deep, meaningful, and safe exploration of those things, right? And as you intuit, and I agree with you very much, I think in the West, while we do have some reference, these are quite young, like these are more like 50, 60 years about how we use these substances. And I actually do think that actually psychedelics and meditation practices can be very, very compatible. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how we can maybe use mindfulness related contexts to harness psychedelic therapy, for example, and this comes to mind also for consciousness research. I spoke a lot about in the talk about, phenomenology and disciplined approach to understand experience. A big part of meditation traditions are about the same principle, how to practice experience in a meaningful, disciplined, structured fashion. So yes, I would say, yeah, a lot of it can be taken, extracted, and adapted from these traditions.
So I just had a question, because obviously there is a lot of research going into the clinical application of psychedelics, especially with psychiatric treatments, for example. And I was just wondering how big the risk, if there is any at all, about psychedelics worsening certain conditions such as schizophrenia, or even causing certain disorders like hallucinogenic persistent disorder, HPPD. I don't know the exact term for it. But I was just wondering, in your research or from your knowledge, is there like a big risk of that happening, or is it very limited?
Okay, so the question is a good question. Thank you. It's about all the clinical research looking into the benefits. How about the negatives? And maybe in the possibility that psychedelics could induce hallucinogen persisting disorders or forms of schizophrenia. What we know now, and then again, there's very little research on this, but what we know is when people are screened out with a family history of schizophrenia or a personal history of schizophrenia, and the context is controlled to a certain extent, the setting, there's a mindful approach to set and setting. We don't see this in research contexts. So I think maybe now 10,000 people might have gone through these experiences in lab conditions, and we've seen non-registered, recorded sort of happenings of this. So I think a lot of it has to do, you know, from a scientific perspective, it's very hard to determine what is exclusive to the psychedelic, these events happening in combination to the use of cannabis, and how much is also related to, you know, pre-existing conditions of people going into these experiences. Right? So it's very hard to determine. But in our lab, we are doing some work into that and interviewing specifically medics in emergency rooms who are, you know, receiving people with psychotic breaks and schizophrenic episodes following the ingestion of the psychedelic, and following up on these patients to see if it's a persisting sort of thing. And when it comes to HPPD, or hallucinogen persisting disorder, I think the scenario appears to be very complicated and very non-straightforward. There seems to be a combination of substances, pre-existing conditions of anxiety, or, you know, very elevated anxiety apparently. And then there's the other aspect, and this is very hypothetical and speculative, that I think a lot of people actually do, you know, that have used psychedelics do experience some degree of change in perception, which is fairly long lasting, but that it's not disturbing. It's not something that they report as being distressful or annoying to a certain extent. So there's a lot of it happening around the attribution of the symptom in these cases. But then again, when it comes to this, I'm not an expert, and there is some research on that you know, can be looked into.
Yes, I agree. This has been a great Friday night until now, at least. So we thank you very much for this interesting possibility to come here to discuss and learn something new. My question was about that you keep coming back to the individuality, and you listed some aspects that are important in the experiences, and it said personality. And I was quite interested in if you could elaborate what kind of personality characteristics you think of, because I also noticed that in the diagrams you showed that the anxiety levels were very low. And that kind of led me also to thinking that how do you select your participants? Do you have a selection according to perhaps personality, and how does that selection look like?
Right, yeah, that's a good question. So how do we select participants to try to, you know, for them to be safe experiences? So the kind of graphs and charts and all the data that I've shown here is all about healthy individuals that go into the research. And how do we select them? We screen them, and they're screened by a psychiatrist so that we can rule out any sort of psychiatric disorders. This is within the non-clinical research, right? The consciousness research that we do at Imperial. So that's the way that we do it. We don't really do, you know, we don't screen their personality with a questionnaire or anything, but, you know, the psychiatrist does employ several techniques and tools to determine whether or not somebody is going through an episode of depression or mania, or has a, you know, preconditions related to schizophrenia and so on.
I was just very persistent here asking, because it said like that the experience is it's related to the setting, for example, and then personality and so on. So I was like kind of interesting that, and you keep saying sometimes that, well, some people, they don't get a good experience. That can you relate that somehow to personality characteristics?
Oh yeah. So there's one paper I think that looks into this, and it says like high, you know, trait neuroticism is linked to challenging experiences. I don't quite, out of the top of my mind, other sort of conditions, but that's one of them. And then, you know, mystical experiences related to openness, personality factor. I don't know if you know this personality factor. Cool. And also trait absorption. But there's a nice review paper, that goes through all the data, existing data, and it's a meta-analysis of this whole thing, which is quite useful as a guide.
Follow-up question, but the challenging experiences not always correlate with negative effects, right? Even challenging experiences can lead to well-being, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, I think some of the work of John Hopkins' research has shown that is a possibility. Yeah, challenging experiences can be related to positive outcomes many times, but I don't know if there's any rule there that has been established.
So I'd like to hear you speak, and I understand that this is still a black box, like what is actually happening that leads to positive effects and well-being. And just to frame, I'm grounded in psychology, and in my understanding, the concept of diffusion that we have in ACT, acceptance commitment training, where you diffuse from your thoughts and emotions and so on. But also for me, I'm really, really curious, is there any studies, or have you heard about people looking into the actual structure of sense making and meaning making? Because there are research at Harvard, Robert Keegan, Suzanne Kreuter, that looks into how we make sense of the world. And one of my hypotheses is that psychedelics can help us construct our reality in more complex and mature ways. And I'd love to hear you speak. What is in the black box that creates this positive correlation? Just speculate, even if we do not have any evidence for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, and this is precisely what I kind of like hinted here, right? So that in with some form of guidance, psychedelics can provide experiences of deconstruction and therefore reconstruction of experiences, right? So the idea of cognitive diffusion, psychological flexibility, and so on. Again, a window of opportunity in the psychedelic experience to do that. As to the actual mechanisms, that is, I can get super crazy and talk about, speculative thoughts around that. So maybe I'll do that later on. But we don't. I mean, the kind of like more easy answer for that has to do again with the idea that hyperconnectivity happens in this evolved brain systems, right? So when you look at these evolved brain systems and you see how they differ from similar primates, a lot of them have to do with sociality and how we construct our social selves, and it kind of makes sense, right? So this is a development that happens in evolution, but it also happens at the level of the individual when they grow up. And the idea is that these protracted sort of cortical expansion, has to do with in a big way for us to be dependent on, our family systems, which introduce us to culture. And I would say that, in a big way, that process is kind of like a expanded way of making meaning out of life, and developing those initial stories that will, ground and structure the way that we engage and negotiate our relationships in the world. And I would say that that's a plausible sort of, straightforward mechanism of what is going at the brain, at the level of the brain, of flexibilizing these kind of systems related to how we make meaning and how we make stories, right? The idea of abstract semantic processing. And I think, and at the level of experience, it has to do with this. At the level of phenomenology, it has to do with this kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. The intuition would, I would kind of agree with you. And this is spontaneously something that a lot of people do, A lot of people say, yeah, I had a thing with psychedelics in my 20s and then I completely stopped because it was just not interesting to me anymore, right? I couldn't really see anything else to do with that. So I think that there's a lot to say about that, and there's a lot to say about also, I think, doing it too young, doing it too early. It's a way of shuffling meaning a bit too much. But yeah, Thank you for the question. Very interesting. No, at the level of the brain, we haven't seen, no, we haven't done that. But we might. I mean, it's a good, you know, it's an easy enough thing to do. We have a lot of brain under psychedelics and we have their age, so we can maybe do those correlations. Yeah.
Okay. We have to end this lecture and this talk now. And again, thank you very much for this. And thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it half as much as I did. That would be way better than good enough. So, yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.